As Professor Błoński did introductions of our speakers, so I will just say their names before they will be asked to have some opening remarks. And as you can notice, the topic of this panel is Troubled Times in Divided World, Future of Europe After Brexit. The topic is really broad, but when you look at it, it says troubled times, so it suggests that we may hear many bad information today. But in the age of the media bias towards negative information and bad news, I hope we'll also hear some optimistic message for Poland, for Europe, for the world. And also to receive some inspiration from you, our guests. We will focus on few issues. I am sure some of the speakers will focus mostly on Brexit and its consequences for the European Union. When you look at this panel description, there are many divisions listed. It's Brexit versus European Union, elites versus ordinary people, populism versus rule of law and constitutionalism, liberal democracy versus the illiberal trends. And so, as I said, there are many issues inside this panel. But first, we'll start from the short opening statements from our speakers. Then we'll have some discussion here and questions. And of course, we are looking for questions from you. So when the speakers are talking, you can already think about your questions. And I hope there will be interesting discussion following the short speeches of our guests. So first I would like to ask Barbara Kolm, the president of the Austrian Economic Center and chief organizer of the Free Market Roadshow, for her short speech.
Well, thank you very much, Marek, and I would like to thank the hosts here and also for welcoming us back in Warsaw. It's always a privilege to cooperate with you, and let me also point out, since there are many students, that the Austrian Economic Center in Vienna runs internship programs, and I discussed yesterday with the dean that, of course, you as students are most welcome to apply for that. Check it out on our website, as you should also look up the website of the Free Market Roadshow, where you find all the PowerPoint presentations of previous events, of the 43 events that we had already done. And you will also find information on cooperation, on programs, on internships, etc., etc. Troubled times in a divided world. Actually, the topic the main topic of this year's conference is not only a challenge, but it's being an Austrian economist. I would say we have to view it very positively. By the way, who of you is familiar with Austrian economics? Okay, so I don't have to quote anybody, and I feel at home already. Actually, we could leave. Thank you, Marek, for bringing those wonderful students here. But to be honest, Brexit has two pages, it has two sides. And we also have to be very careful through which lens we look. We have to look at it from the Western European lens, and we have to look through it from the Eastern European lens. The EU has different advantages and disadvantages for both sides in Europe on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, there is the channel dividing continental Europe and Great Britain. And I was looking up a couple of Lady Thatcher's talks and speeches that she presented in the late 70s, early 80s, when Great Britain was debating with the EU, especially the rebates and the financial situation, and also ECB and the monetary issues and the currency issues. And she was always warning that the ever closer union would destroy competitiveness. By the ever closer union, and this is obviously a model that we see these days, she meant that centrally organized and planned out of Brussels, where nation states don't have much say. We know this is not true. There is always, again, two perspectives to look at. So this is one point. The second point is, and this is where probably my colleague here, Richard Teather, will argue, London will be the new Singapore in terms of competitiveness, in terms of jobs, in terms of taxes, in terms of financial institutions. If that happens, then this will be very positive for us in Europe, because finally there will be somebody who is definitely challenging us in front of our doorstep. We have lost this challenge. We have been very, cozy living in this nudged Europe world where things work out, where we have delegated on a national and on a supranational level, where we have outsourced solutions. So I think this is something that we have to look into. And let's quickly look at the reality. Let's have a reality check. We definitely live in a post-political era. We have populism versus the elite. We have protectionism versus reason. And I think we all know and agree that protectionism doesn't get us anywhere. We have to be very careful on that. We have lifestyle politics versus interest politics. And we have Wall Street versus Main Street. This is where we have the somewheres and the anywheres, where the people who believe in globalization, in true competition, are in contrast to those who want to stick to the status quo ante. And we all know that staying and not moving forward does not bring us anywhere. Europe was always most successful when we were competing on a regional level and when political entities were smaller than economic entities. In other words, without competition, without openness, we will not get anywhere. So this is the challenges, the real challenges that we face nowadays in Europe, to come back to the original positive idea that was when we were founded. It was not only the peace project, it was the 4 European freedoms that we need to defend and that we need to put in practice. But on the other hand, and we also have to, and this is what my last sentence, Marek, don't get nervous, we failed, and we clearly have to state that. We failed when we tried to solve the financial crisis. The bailouts of Greece and other countries were not good. They did not solve the problem. We kicked the can down the road. One thing. Second thing, security issues, and I'm only saying Ukraine. I don't have to say anything else here in Poland. Here is something where we completely, as European Union, have failed. And we did not even delegate it to NATO. And the third thing where we have failed is the migration issues and the migration crisis, where we waited way too long to react, and now we fear the consequences in Austria, in Germany, in Sweden, in France, and those things are not positive. So it is a challenge to bring Europe back on track, but it can be done if we reform. And reforms, as you all know here, hurt, but we will succeed in the end. So we need brave politicians who take up the challenge, but it also needs young people who push them. And I just announced a new project that we will start very soon. It's called Values for Europe, where we invite sensible people who think and act to join us on a platform and share their thoughts and ideas. What are the real values that we share in Europe? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara. And Barbara Kolm said that reforms hurt, and in Poland we often heard about social costs of transformation, but we should also remember about social costs of no reforms or social costs of no transformation, and these costs will be much higher if European Union doesn't go in the pro-reform and pro-liberal way. Now I would like to ask Mr. Richard Teather about his comments, especially on Brexit and the Singapore option.
Thank you. We've been having these arguments among the panel for the last few days. So I'm British, I supported Brexit, and I'm here on a liberal panel with lots of people saying the European Union is a great liberalising force. How could you leave it? Why did you want to leave it? So now I've got a chance, I've got 5 minutes to tell you why I think that Britain leaving the EU was certainly good for Britain. Whether it's good for the rest of the EU, I'm not quite so sure. But thank you first for the introduction and the opportunity. I did do some quick mathematics during the introduction when she pointed out that all these great liberal economists live for 92 years. That means I'm now exactly halfway through. So perhaps I should become a socialist at this point.
You want to die.
So, why does Britain leave the EU? What's wrong with the EU? And they all keep talking about... I'm going to stand up. I've sat down all day. So, people keep talking about how the European Union is a great liberalising force, and Daniel keeps telling us all about this, all the great things that it's done. Yes, the European Union has done good things. After the war, when we had very protectionist attitudes, yes, it helped open out, it helped open markets. But the fact that it was good in the 1950s does not mean that it's useful now. We don't use the same computers that we used in the 1950s, even though they were really helpful back then. Times have changed, times have moved on. The issues have become different. The whole geography has changed. You know, we talk about, Barbara just mentioned the English Channel, and Britain is physically separated from Europe. I think one of our policies is actually to move another 50 miles away from you post-Brexit. So we're just working on the engineering on that one. But those things don't matter so much anymore. When the European Union was founded, the rest of the world was a long way away. That doesn't matter now. Transport costs have reduced so much that your physical location is not so important. Singapore, it's off in the Far East. It's a brilliant, successful economy, not near any of its major trading partners. We buy all our stuff from China on the other side of the world. The physical difference does not matter. And that's one of the big changes that the European Union has failed to grasp. And the EU, I believe, has ceased to be part of the solution and has started to become part of the problem. Two reasons for that. One is the Fortress Europe mentality. That yes, within the European Union we have free trade, we have liberalisation, we have movement of goods and people and services and capital, and that's all good. But as regards the rest of the world, the EU tries to build a big wall around the European Union and keep everything else out. And that's the big problem. That's where they failed to grasp the fact that the world is now a bigger place and we need to be dealing with the rest of the world as well. And if you talk to the people, as I do, who have been negotiating international trade agreements, TTIP, the EU-American deal, the EU-Canadian deal, all those things, what they all say is that the attitude of the European Union is not one of opportunity. It's not one of trying to expand markets, to open out into new areas. It's one of fear. The EU negotiators' primary aim is to make sure that they do not lose. They're looking at the businesses, the jobs that they've got, and they're trying to work out how to protect those rather than how to expand and create new opportunities. And that's a very restricting force. That's a very anti-liberal force. That's a very protectionist, inward-looking idea. And that's what's behind a lot of the EU things. They're looking more at how to protect what they've got rather than how to expand and get something new. That's one of the big reasons why I was in favour of the EU leaving. And the whole attitude of the EU, many of the other things are based on this fear. One of the other problems that we had with the EU, that Britain had with the EU, was a lot of regulation. The EU was regulating things that were not necessary for part of the cooperation, for part of the free market. Employment regulation, for example, a lot of that comes from the EU. You don't need it to have international trade. We trade with the rest of the world without harmonising our employment regulations, but it's back to this fear again. Rather than trying to expand and create new jobs and seeing that as your primary goal, a lot of the EU regulation comes from the French, a lot of it is trying to protect what you've already got. You look at the French economy, it's very restricted jobs market. Once you're in a job, you're safe. But you try getting a job, because businesses are very unwilling to take on people if they can't get rid of them later on. The UK has the opposite idea. They say, let's have people, let's create jobs, and yes, we lose jobs all the time as well. There's a churn. People are going in and out of work. But that creates more opportunities, especially for young people, to get in at the bottom. So that's really where we're coming from the UK, is to try and get rid of that. And yes, we're going to have to, people are saying, if you want to be in the single market, if you want to trade, you're going to have to adopt EU regulations. Well, perhaps we will, but what we're hopefully going to have is a two-track approach. We'll have a dual twin regulatory approach. If you want to trade within the European Union, then you'll follow the EU-approved regulations and have access to the single market. If you don't, if you're trading within the UK or with the rest of the world, because what we really want is trade agreements with the whole rest of the world, then you don't have to do that. You can ignore all the EU stuff. So anyway, I'm running out of time. Is Brexit going to work? I hope so. The problem was there were not two sides in the Brexit campaign in the UK. There were three. There was the pro-EU side. There was the anti-EU liberal side, which says we want to be opened out, we want to break out of Fortress Europe and trade and do business with all of the world. And then there was the third side, which was the protectionist Little Englander approach, which says we want to move the UK away from Europe, we want to protect ourselves and just be on our own. Now, which of those two Brexit sides is going to win is going to be the big contest for the UK for the next few years. I hope we're going to become the Singapore of Europe. I hope we're going to be a low-tax, low-regulation, outward-looking, expansionist economy. And I sincerely hope that that's what's going to happen and that's what's work. And then, as Barbara says, will be an example to you all. What was the phrase? Britain has saved Europe by its efforts and will then save you by our example. So we will give the example of how you can make internationalism, liberal economics work, as Barbara says, right on your doorstep. So, thank you.
Thank you. And now I would like to ask for comments and maybe also a response as Mr. Daniel Kaddik from Friedrich Neumann Foundation, representing Friedrich Neumann Foundation at the Southeast Europe, working in Romania, Bulgaria, Moldova, and this part of the world.
Well, thank you very much, Marek. I could say a lot now, just answering what Richard has spoken about. Talking about what I think about his ideas and how most of those probably won't work. Because for once, and I agree with that, the little English has won. And it will be not Great Britain, it will be Little Britain to a large extent. Especially when you close off your market. Especially when you close off your market to your biggest trading partners. And I urge you to look at the map of economic complexity, to look at how much intertwined the British economy is with the European one. But that's not the only problem. One of the biggest problems is the nationalism that fueled the entire campaign. It was not an EU reform campaign, which I would have greeted wholeheartedly. I'm not a big fan of how the European Union works right now. I think it's an institution that was largely built on sand. And you've seen with all the external and internal shocks that the European Union has suffered in the last years, that it was a good weather project. As long as the sun is shining, everything is peachy. As soon as it starts raining, you see that the roof is leaking. And instead of trying to fix the roof, the Brits tried to demolish it, unfortunately. I studied in the UK, I love the UK, and I really would have liked the UK to remain. I really would have liked the European Union to reform. Maybe at least the last thing would happen. As you've seen with the Summit of Rome, the European Commission finally admitted that they've only been working ad hoc. And finally they're developing a plan of what they want Europe to be. And it's finally good that they do that. For a very simple reason. Because this, well, we're going to go in some direction, we don't know where we're going, has fueled a lot of populism. It has disenfranchised people with the European Union. Especially if you look around, we live in a world of massive reconfiguration, both political and economically. And we have seen unprecedented change in the last 27 years, both economically and politically. And change is coming ever more rapid information is flowing a lot faster than before, and the perceived reality is becoming ever more complex. And just imagine that mankind has made more progress in the last 100 years than in the 100,000 years before that. And from my side, the peace argument is always saying, yeah, let's not talk about that. But we've seen a period in the European Union, in Europe, where countries like Germany and UK and France and Poland have not started bashing each other's heads in. That's quite positive if you ask me. But more importantly for me is that the European Union has the four freedoms. It has the freedom of goods, services, people, capital. And it has expanded the personal and economic freedom across national borders. And it has enabled growth by trade. But again, growth by trade means exposure. And exposure means more information. And information that people have to make sense of. And the great philosopher and politician and former chairman of my foundation, Lord Ralph Dahrendorf, has examined that question already 20 years ago, in 1997, when he examined globalization and its social consequences. And on one hand, he sees chances for millions and millions of people by the unifying power of trade and exchange. But he also predicts something else, and that's a rise of new regionalism that seeks retreat in ever more closed environments, out of fear of increased complex global of a more complex global economic world. And the mass retreat that seeks salvation in nation states, regions, or religious communities. And I think he's right about that. And if you look around what globalization and trade have done, there seems to be a certain cognitive dissonance. People like to enjoy the freedoms that they have, but they don't like the fact that they live in this kind of globalized world. And these kind of messages that populists then try to prey on fall on very fertile ground. And if you look at all countries around the world, if you look at polls, people think that the world has been getting worse in the last years and years, even though the global poverty has fallen in the last 50 years more than in the 500 before that. 71% of Brits think that their kids will be worse off. And it's no wonder, and I want to come to a close with that. Number one, especially the political left, instead of going into discussion, they have been trying to bash people on the right wing, just population that has been trying to point out problems. They're saying you're stupid, you're Nazis, whatever, when they were pointing out to an actual or perceived problem. Instead of listening, instead of going into dialogue, they've been saying you've been stupid. Then we have the social industry that preys on these kind of issues. And last but not least, you have the media that has to channel more and more rapid flow of information and has to have more sensational news. Nobody cares about the 40 million airplanes that land safely each year. It's the one that doesn't that makes the headlines. And I could say a lot of more things about these issues, but the fundamental problem is we have a great divide between A, the political context, and B, the people. And something populists are very good at, looking at this, sniffing out what the problems are, and packaging their simplistic and wrong answers in a very, very simple language. A language that people are able to understand.
Thank you, Daniel. We've just heard two different visions on Brexit and the European Union, and now I am sure we will hear some interesting thoughts about the legal issues connected with Brexit. Mikołaj Barczentewicz is a lawyer. He commented on Brexit legal issues on BBC and other British media. So, Mikołaj, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I teach UK public law, and I'm an academic lawyer, so I will talk about problems characteristically, I think. I will make three simple points based on an assumption that more of open markets is value. And then the question is, how can we retain the current level of openness or improve on it? So I think we share this framework, this benchmark with all the speakers here. But the first point I wanted to make is that when you have idealists who see an end state a goal on an island far away, like a great free trading nation of, you know, a countryside, a big country-sized Singapore. When you see that, and to get there, you do have to be a revolutionary. But one problem with revolutionaries is that they sort of, by their nature, have to disregard costs of transition. They don't think about transition. And then some revolutionaries, well, they bring such costs of transition that then they get counter-revolutions justly. Some succeed, but I think it is something about being an idealist and a revolutionary that you disregard it. But let's talk about costs of transition. So I think even assuming that conceivably, or at least theoretically, Britain could be better off outside of the EU, it will be very costly in the short term, probably in the middle term, 10, 15 years. Lots of people will suffer because it will require major restructuring of the internal economy in Britain. If you open agriculture, Britain will not have agriculture anymore, and so on and so forth. So people will have to transition. They will suffer. There are costs, and that's not trivial. It has to be mentioned. The second point I wanted to make, which is something I think the current government and the Right Honourable Prime Minister, she's very cagey and unclear and not very open about, which is what are the prospects of getting a good deal from Michel Barnier and the EU negotiators? Because even if you assume that the European Commission has a will to have a smooth sort of transition with the United Kingdom, there are very tricky legal issues of who exactly gets a veto over the future deal. So yes, the famous Article 50 deal, that only requires a qualified majority vote in the European Council, which represents all the rest of 27 EU members. But if for any comprehensive trade deal that will follow and will have to follow, perhaps even very soon. So there are debates over that, whether you can have just this Article 50 transition without a comprehensive deal at the same time. There is no clear legal answer to it. But then everyone gets a veto. And then it's you multiply all those interests that will be represented, and people who will want a pound of British flesh, so to speak. And there is another issue of how sort of economically rational, from the perspective of open markets, those people on the other side of the negotiating table are. Because we may believe in open markets and free trade, but some people really find mercantilism and trade wars a very intuitive idea, and they might approach negotiations in that spirit. And the last point I wanted to raise is the issue of, so what happens on the no deal scenario? Because again, the Right Honourable Prime Minister, she said that a no deal is better than a bad deal. So if a bad deal is quite likely to happen, as I think it is, then the question is, so what's the no deal scenario? And in one of the first statements in the white paper, we had free trade mentioned many times. But ask yourselves, does the Right Honourable Prime Minister, is she a free trader at heart? And I don't think she is, because imagine, so you may not know much about UK internal politics, but really there is no strong constituency for the kind of pain and restructuring that would be required to transition UK economy into a truly free trading economy without agricultural subsidies, without protectionism in agriculture and industry, to really integrate the way Hong Kong or Singapore are, the UK with the rest of the world economy. That would be, there are no votes for it. Very few. And certainly the unions and many people who voted for Brexit, they will not they will not be very happy with that. So what happens on no deal scenario? I think a dream of Jeremy Corbyn is what we are much more likely to get than the dream that Richard has. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mikołaj. And as the last speaker, I would like Spasimir Domaradzki from Lazarski University to have his comments. I already read parts of his notes, so I understand it will be about the freedom in the European Union context. Spasimir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marek. At the beginning, it was said that we should deliver an optimistic message in crisis times, and I don't know whether we should say it's going to be worst. But my point, which I would like to raise, is that when we try to talk about Brexit, we tend to look at it as something that has already happened, and that we are now starting to build new sandcastles, having the believe that we can build something better, or probably replace the sand with stones. However, I think that what we do not do is actually the fact that we do not have a deeper reflection on the reasons for the Brexit, and we do not try to allow a fair discussion on what should be the nature of the process of European integration. Because the Brexit is a consequence, it is not a beginning. It is a consequence of the fact that within the process of European integration, suddenly this dreamed formula, repeated as a mantra after the Maastricht Treaty about the ever closer union, became a self-fulfilling prophecy that doesn't allow any type of critical reflection. What the hell is happening with the European Union? Where we are going and how we are supposed to build something together. I think that one of the main reasons that I'm going to try to focus on within my short introductory remarks are actually the mental borders that constitute an insurmountable obstacle for the process of European integration. Most of the Eurocrats tend to believe that once an enlargement takes place, it is a fait accompli. There is no need to discuss it anymore. There are some cohesion funds, some structural funds, money will be poured, and suddenly everything is going to start working smoothly. There is a deep neglect for the negative consequences of the 4 freedoms that are absolutely fundamental for the process of European integration. If we are following closely what the people are saying in Great Britain, it is not that they hate the EU. What they do is they see the consequences of the enlargement. Suddenly we realize today when you read Deutsche Welle that when you talk about the land property, it appears that within the countries that joined in 2007 and 2013, you have people that are after the transition period on land, accumulating land, depriving those who were not capable to accumulate sufficient wealth to protect it within United Europe. It is within the mental borders of the politicians of the European Union when you can see or hear arguments that certain countries should sit silent, or when you don't hear actually arguments that treat the two sides equally. We talk about the freedom of trade, and in the same time you suddenly realize that when Polish companies are benefiting from transportation because they are more competitive, the European Union introduces restrictions that are actually benefiting the traders from Germany or France. And if we follow these examples, we suddenly realize that we are creating another monster. There is nothing bad in creating monsters. Now they're very popular for children in particular. But what is the problem with monsters is that if you are not able to civilize them, then they will eventually eat you. And this is the problem of the European Union in a nutshell. If I can just make a clear argument that Milton Friedman practically brought up, it is ethics that should be left to the individual to decide. And when we have a political discourse in which you suddenly label everybody who claims that there needs to be a reformulation of the European Union as populist or Eurosceptic, and as such is excluded from the political debate, how we can practically control the process of integration that seems to be, at least for the remaining 27 countries, the only considerable alternative for the future of Europe. Thank you.
I would like to have a question to Richard Teather first, because you mentioned this Singapore option for European Union, but I think very interesting issue here in Poland is the issue of migration, and how do you see migration after Brexit, especially within the European Union and between European Union and United Kingdom?
Thank you. Yes. Now, of course, one of the big advantages of Brexit and one of the big issues in the campaign was that post-Brexit, the UK will be able to adopt its own immigration policy rather than the EU's. Now, some people are seeing this as being restrictive, closing the borders, fewer people coming in. My comment on this is that what we are doing is we are getting away from a racist immigration policy. The EU's immigration policy is effectively racist. But why? Because it is, as I said, open borders within the European Union, closed borders, fortress Europe for everybody outside. And what we've had is a system where we have to, the UK has to allow in everybody from within the European Union, and therefore, because immigration then becomes a political issue, we start talking about too many people coming in, all this sort of thing. That becomes a big populist campaign. Yes, I agree with you, there have been problems with that. We then start putting excessive restrictions on the number of people we allow into the country from outside because of this imbalance. One thing that's we're going to be able to do post-Brexit is to have a more balanced immigration policy, like something like the Australian system, points-based system. We score people on what they're bringing to the country to decide whether to allow in. And therefore we can do that on a balanced basis. Now, we might, my personal opinion is that we ought to have a completely open immigration policy and allow in anybody who's willing to come and contribute. Practically, on a political basis, I don't think that's possible. But within the confines of the political debate, opening out, treating all of the world the same, rather than having this EU focus, is going to mean that for any given level of immigration, we can have a much more balanced policy outside the EU than we can have within the EU.
Thank you, Richard. I noticed that Barbara made some notes during speeches of our previous speakers, so I would also like you to respond to these speeches, but I have also a question about the very popular word that we hear nowadays in Europe, which is populism. And of course, there are many definitions of populism, from very scientific ones to just calling populist everything we just don't like. And my question is, to what extent do you think that the problems in the European Union are fueling this, I don't know, far right and far wing parties, or is there a problem with domestic policy of particular countries that is fueling this far right and far left movements?
Thank you, Marek. First of all, I think we mix populism. We put everything into one basket. There is so-called left-wing populism and there is so-called right-wing populism. And I think one of the best examples is Marine Le Pen. She is claimed to be a right-wing populist. If we look at her economic politics and policies, she's ultra-left. I mean, she wants higher taxes. She wants more protection. She wants less hours worked per week. She wants more holidays for the people. She completely wipes out productivity. She doesn't understand how markets work. And she eventually, if she had been, or if she were in power, she would put France even in more serious structural problems that they are in. And on the other hand, she is a nationalist, and interestingly enough, everybody who is somebody who wants to protect his home country is a nationalist, is labeled as a nationalist. I mean, I'm an Austrian, but I'm actually first a Tyrolean, and then I will be a European, and then I'm looking at my home country, Austria. But I'm a Tyrolean first. And I think we all have this, our roots in our mindset. And I think this is what makes Europe Europe is made of the diversity of the many different regions, of the many different languages, of the many different talents that we have. And this is our advantage. So it's too easy to say either left or right. So we have to look into depth, and we must not follow the media who just claim this in this way. First thing. Second thing, populism, definitely, it's easier for populists to rise having seen or viewing the problems we face in Europe. I mentioned those three that we have, the bailouts, the security crisis, and the migration issues. But there are many others. It was mentioned overregulation. It was mentioned the currency issues, ECB, all those things that we have not solved. And again, here we have to blame, and I was in politics, so I take the liberty and the freedom to bash politicians a little bit here. Of course, present ones are accepted, but people make it too easy. And if Juncker, and I quote his spokesperson Selmayr, says, he can only dedicate 30 minutes per week, not per day, per week, to Brexit, then I think this doesn't help us anywhere. We won't get anywhere. So we have to really reconsider and go into more depth and look at the real issues, and again allow the businesses to be more open. And the notes I took was on the trade issues. And I think with regards to trade, and then I will stop, Britain has been the nation of traders. And after all, I mean, where does Adam Smith come from? Where do all those people come from who made those remarks and who taught us that free trade is improving our situation? And trust me, what we have these days is not free trade. It's managed trade. Some people in our panels even say it's fake free trade. This doesn't have anything to do with what libertarians or pro-market people consider unilateral free trade. And again, this is the issue that we have had in many other, divides, that we try to solve the problems, today's problems, with past solutions or potential solutions. They don't work. We have to look further and be brave and even mix theories and mix things and just think out new. And again, why should unilateral free trade not work for us now in Europe? We don't need this one-size-fits-all solutions.
Thank you. I noticed, Daniel, that he wanted to respond, but first I would like to ask Mikołaj about one legal issue connected also with Brexit, because on the one side we have United Kingdom, and on the other side we have European Union, which is then 27 members with different national interests. And aren't you afraid that the whole negotiation process will focus more on negotiations between these 27 member states and fights for their national interests? We already heard from the Polish government what they expect from Brexit, and different countries have different expectations. So do you think European Union as a structure is ready for this type of negotiations?
I mean, the process of negotiations, it's a bit of a mess now, because we don't really know what the structure is going to be, and we don't even know who has power, and who has power depends on who decides, and we don't know who decides because that depends on what sort of a voting procedure and what sort of a ratification procedure will be necessary for the transitional and for the final deal. And no one knows that because the law is unclear, and we'll probably end up in litigation before the Court of Justice, and what the Court of Justice will say, no one knows. They probably don't know yet. So it could be that it will be not just unanimity in the Council, which means heads of states and government, but might mean the Canada situation with several Belgian parliaments voting and so on, and then you'll be in a very interesting situation, because you can negotiate the nicest things with Michel Barnier, but if it's not ratified by if it's a comprehensive mixed agreement which requires that sort of ratification, they will never be in force. So it really depends on how many veto players you get, and we don't know how many you'll get.
Thank you, Mikołaj. And now I would like Daniel to, of course, respond to comments by Barbara and Richard. But I would also like to ask you about the countries that you are working in. There are many countries which are still not in the European Union. And do you think the current developments in the European Union are discouraging or encouraging local politicians to join the club?
Okay, very good question. Thank you very much. Just 3 points before I answer. Number one, question of immigration. Nobody stopped the UK from having a proper immigration law. Nobody stopped Germany from having a proper immigration law in the first place. It's just lazy claiming that, whoa, we have all the EU foreigners, so we can't have an own immigration law. That's just intellectually lazy to claim something like that. Number two, topics that Barbara mentioned. Yes, I agree. These are very important issues that need to be discussed on the European level, about trade. But honestly, that's not what drives the divide between the ruling class and the people. Most people don't give a shit about most of the issues that are discussed in politics. Let's be honest. And most of the political discourse is led in a way that people are not able to understand what is discussed. Yes, it is important for their lives what's discussed, but they don't perceive it that way. If we talk about global financial crisis and these kind of issues, people are not able to relate to that. They just see that there is something going on that they don't understand. And then we're coming to my third issue, and that is populism. What do populists do? They translate the messages in a language that people are actually able to understand. And what they also do, they find scapegoats. They find others who are responsible for their problem. It's not your fault. You don't have to change. The world might be changing, but we can turn back the clock. You don't have to change. I will take care of you for that. I'm the Messiah. And that's a problem. And then coming back to your last question, that is something we see in Eastern Europe. Well, we both are Bulgarians. You by birth, I'm by association. That is something we see there. We have Boyko Borisov, the prime minister, who has been prime minister for the largest part of the last 10 years, which Bulgaria has been part of the European Union of. He has not done anything improving the situation in this country. If you look at the Cooperation and Verification Mechanism report of the last 10 years, nothing has changed in the areas of fighting corruption, rule of law, or the category that was only introduced for Bulgaria, fighting organized crime. Nothing has changed there. Yet, people still believe in the European Union. In countries like Bulgaria and Romania, the trust in the European Union is a lot higher than in local politics. Why? Because they see the political discourse and the political situation as completely corrupt. Also, and why does the European Union still have any appeal to countries like Moldova or Macedonia? Because in those countries, the European Union is seen differently than in core European countries. It is rather seen as a room of values where people want to be part of. They see that there is prosperity, that they are protected against something else. Just as the populists are claiming that they're protecting the people against something. And they're reinforcing this idea of we versus them. And that's also something that Dahrendorf said, that people try to retreat. And instead of leading the discourse, instead of being more popular in their languages, politicians very often resort to, that has been said earlier, trying to tell other people, you're Nazis, you're stupid. You cannot lead that kind of discourse. You have to lead this kind of discourse, because that's what democracy is built on. Democracy is built on discourse, and that is something that has been completely neglected. Just as talking about what future we want with Europe has been completely neglected in the past.
I noticed Barbara that she wants to have an answer, response. We'll have Barbara, then we'll have Spasimir, and then think about your questions, because we'll move to the discussion with the audience.
Well, Daniel, with all due respect, but you're a populist yourself. I mean, this...
Yeah. No, I'm popular, not a popular.
No, you are a true populist because you do not look at the facts and figures and numbers. And this is what economists do. And politicians sometimes don't. And you know, if income is reduced, and this is what the citizens, what the people feel, they feel it in their pockets, then people vote differently, and then they understand. And no, you said it. People are stupid, and people don't understand what politicians talk about. Exactly, this is what you said. And you know, when it comes to free trade, people understand when all of a sudden they cannot buy shoes of 100 different brands any longer, or they will be, you know, they will be upset if they can't get those phones on the market any longer, and if they have to go to the black market. And this is, you know, that people understand, and they are not as stupid as you claimed them. Because, you know, the Freedom Party in Germany totally fell into this trap when they were in government, and when they only lowered or reduced taxes for one group of people, and then all of a sudden people kicked them out of government. They didn't vote for them anymore. People understand the big picture as well. They are not as simple and as stupid. And this is why we actually should deliver facts and should discuss economics and should discuss and must discuss and debate not populist measures, but reforms. Real, true reforms. And so don't make it as simple. It is not that simple, unfortunately.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Barbara. And now I would like to ask Spasimir to have his final comments, also from this perspective of someone from the Central Eastern Europe. I would like to ask you about the future of European Union without Britain, because in Poland we are also afraid that losing Britain from this voting system inside the European Union will be dangerous, because French politics may have more influence, which is more statist and less liberal. So do you think that Central Eastern Europe may have some important contribution nowadays to the future of Europe and free market in the European Union?
Let me put it that way. Answering briefly your question, I think that we in Poland have a unique skill to bet usually on the worst horse in the race, and we are always searching for alliances that eventually in which we end up alone, and that's somehow the historical trace, if you see. And unfortunately, yes, I do believe that having in mind the particular accent on closer political relations with the British government, the fact that Great Britain leaves will put Poland in a very difficult position. I don't want to discuss the present-day politics. I don't think this is why we gathered here, but we definitely see also that the way the European integration is interpreted recently in our country makes us literally alone also within those 27 countries. So that's another issue that I think deserves attention. But there were a couple of words said that were extremely important, especially concerning the question of soft power. Barbara is absolutely right about the numbers, and I think it's impossible to discuss the fact that in comparative terms, what was the reality in Central and Eastern Europe 25 years ago and what it is today proves that the integration process was absolutely necessary. But again, I think the devil is in the details, because if there was anything that was a driving force within the process, within the decision of the Central and Eastern European countries to join, that was not only the idea of getting better, but also of catching up. The idea that one day we will be living like the Germans, like the French, like the others. And what is the problem? I think one of the things that is quite often ignored, that is absolutely actually not discussed, is the fact that those countries came out of social equality. That was a extremely poor social equality, but people were equally poor. And when they came from socially poor equality, they wanted to become, as far as I can imagine, socially equally wealthy. And what's the worst part of it? They're not today. And we can say, well, we are both countries still catching up, and what is worse, the European integration is also a process. It is not a built house. And that makes it even more difficult, but there is no doubt that the tool that was picked up, the fact that you liberalize the markets, you create the opportunities, should become the driving force for being better off. We can go into the details. We can ask ourselves into what extent we have a transfer of technology that was presumed to be the idea of foreign direct investments. We can ask ourselves into what extent we have a social cohesion. All these aspects are still in process. Whether the tools are correct, this is something that needs to be discussed, and this is what actually the politicians don't want to discuss, because they know that it will be painful both for the structure that was built and both for their position as those who contributed to it.
Thank you. I will give 60 seconds to Daniel, and then I would like ask you to raise the hand so the microphone can reach you. I know James would like to have a short comment, and then we are ready for more questions.
Okay, very quickly. We can rewatch the tape from previously. I didn't say people are stupid. That's number one. I said that the world's getting more complex, that people have to make sense of it, and that a lot of what happens in the political discourse cannot be understood because of the language that is used. And that's just a fact. Look at how messages are built by a lot of the mainstream politicians and how they're built by the so-called populist forces. And the messages are very easy. I mean, here, I don't have to tell you in Poland that you have a ruling party where the party leader has completely lost his marbles, but what he's still good at is message building. And that is something that is important. I don't doubt, I think we agree completely that we look at numbers. But when we look at numbers, and that is something that a lot of people don't do, they don't understand, because they need to make simple, they need to understand what's going on in their lives. And if you don't have a job, and it's easier to blame others, and it's easier to fall into the trap if somebody tells you it's not your fault. And it's just a proven fact that a lot of those guys who work for those parties tend to follow and believe those messages. And then we come together. That is part of the political discourse that we need to lead. Dahrendorf says that we need political discourse because it's part of political life and life itself. But we cannot leave the political discourse to those people. We need to simplify messages. Economists like you, and me by the way, need to make messages more understandable so they understand why they need to lead a better life and what is needed to ensure that they lead a better life in the future. Thank you, Daniel. And does it work? Yeah, I think so. I would like to ask James to have the first question, but make it short because you are speaking in the second panel, so you can have longer comments.
Yes, absolutely. I think for many people, the EU represents a set of institutions that they trust more than their domestic institutions. And this is a real problem. And when we look at the UK, it's important to remember that most British people trust their domestic institutions more than they trust the EU institutions. And that explains at least part of the reason why the UK is much more comfortable with Brexit than other, for instance, Eastern European countries. Because we've had parliamentary law, because we've had a lawmaking and a courts that we trust. So they're very happy with that. And so when they see the EU trying to override these institutions, they think, why are you doing this? I don't trust you. So there's an enormous question here. And I think the question for the EU is, very often the EU has had a real adherence to free trade. And here's sort of the comment for which I invite questions. But they've decided in many cases to get it through legal obligation. They haven't tried to win hearts and minds. They've just said, do it because we say. And unsurprisingly, a lot of people aren't convinced by that. And the question now becomes, is the EU capable of reform and winning hearts and minds in the future?
Anyone would like to answer this question?
I agree with you. The European Union has done a very shitty job in the past doing that. But let's be quite frank about that. But it's not the fault of the European Union, because the European Union just creates a framework. And look at how decision-making takes place on European level. The Council was already mentioned, where a lot of the decision-making takes place. And when you look at how the European Union is solved, a lot of the problems are said, okay, that's a European problem. Europe brings a problem with us. And so if there's something good, like in Bulgaria and other countries with cohesion funds or similar, then that's a domestic issue. And the European Union has been used as a scapegoat by domestic politicians over and over again. That's a fundamental problem, because even the political class does not seem convinced by that project. And how can you sell that project to the people? How can you sell a project where you don't know where you're going to? What is the European Union? Ask your professor for European studies. What is the European Union? When I studied that funny subject, it was, that's a political body sui generis. Well, thank you very much. It doesn't bring me anywhere. I need to know where it's going. I need to define it, so I need to can define where we're going to, so we can make decisions, and then we can also win the hearts and minds of people and say, that's it, that's where we're going to, that's what we stand for. But that's also something the domestic politicians need to be in for.
Reforms need to be made on the local, regional, national, and supranational level. And if we do not constantly do that, namely aiming for reform, for change, we are dead. And I think this is the most important thing to do. Nothing else.
Thank you. Yes, I agree with James on the trust and institutions, and I think that's a big part of the difference between where some countries are coming from and where other countries are. It's how much you trusted your own institutions, and as to whether the EU institutions are more trustworthy than your domestic ones. So that's a big problem. But on the idea of can the EU reform, we tried and failed. I don't know how much this came out in the Polish press, but the Brexit referendum was a two-stage process. First, we attempted to get a reform of our arrangements with the European Union, and then we put that to a referendum. So the referendum was not supposed to be on Britain's relationship with the EU as it was 5 years ago. It was supposed to be on a newly negotiated relationship with the European Union. That renegotiation utterly failed because the EU would not make, the Commission would not make a sober assessment of the proposals that we put before them. They were rejected out of hand by Juncker and the rest of them. So, people who are saying the UK should have stayed in and tried to reform the EU. And yes, one of the things I'm very sorry for from a Polish point of view, that, very often we were allies within the Council, within Europe. And, the UK withdrawing has taken away a big vote in favour of free trade and liberalisation. And I'm sorry for that. But the people who say the UK should have stayed in and tried to reform, we tried, they wouldn't listen.
I know Spasimir would like to have a comment, but please also raise your hand if you would like to have a question, so then my colleague can deliver a microphone to you during Spasimir's comments. So.
Thank you. It was said that the course on European Union is a funny one, and indeed I am actually running it. And I have to admit that a couple of the faces I see here in the classroom are those that I'm trying to explain for 30 hours what the hell is the EU. And I have to admit that it's quite difficult, and I'm not sure whether I'm actually achieving eventually the goal. However, something very important was said about the trust in the EU and the national institutions, and I would like also to reverse this argument, because there is no doubt that in particular in Central and Eastern Europe it is the case. When you go through the popular support for the integration, you can see that there is way lower trust in national institutions and much higher rates paradoxically for the European Parliament, although people vote and don't know whom they elect for the European Parliament. And even if they elect him, they don't know in which eventually a group of parties he's going to end up. So we have a very difficult case, but there is also another element that strengthens the pathologies which doesn't allow us to discuss the nature of the integration process, and it is the fact that Brussels also selects particular elites, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, which become their only partner, their sole partner for cooperation, for discussion, which actually, on the other hand, cements the position of those political parties within their nation states. And now what you have when you are distrusting your own government, but Brussels likes your prime minister, that actually explains that only because of him you have EU funds. And what is the way out then? Well, unfortunately, Russians know what is the way out. Poor in populism.
Question here, yes?
Marek Dąbrowski, Bruggen case. I have two comments. One is on free trade. When I listen to free trade Brexiters, who definitely they do not constitute majority of Brexit camp, but I have problems to understand what they mean by free trade, because we don't live any longer in Adam Smith's era. And the reality is that trade in goods, especially in case of country like UK, this is a small fraction of total trade. And then even if we think about trade, the rest is trade of services. And when we even think about trade in goods, the import tariffs are not the biggest problem. You mentioned that about external wall of the EU. This doesn't apply to tariffs, because EU has one of the lowest import tariffs for manufacturing goods in the world. So this applies to something else, to non-tariff barriers, so regulation. And I think that despite all criticism about bureaucracy in the EU achieve one big thing, far-going synchronization, standardization of all these non-tariff barriers. And as rightly mentioned, the transition will cost before UK gets to some new free trade regime with the entire world. First, will dismantle this single market regulatory harmonization. So this is a big problem. And second thing is it was rightly mentioned that EU failed on security, but we must understand why. As far as common foreign security policy gives any member country veto power, it will never be effective, because it will always be hostage of any petty interest in various member states. So if we want to reform EU, probably in many areas this requires further transfer of sovereignty. I don't say that in each area, perhaps in some areas it's possible to repatriate powers to national authorities, but in many areas like common foreign security policy or migration policy, this requires more power to EU authorities.
I noticed two questions here, so Adam, can you give microphone to these people? We'll have these comments and questions first for 2-3 minutes, and then all panelists will be able to answer. You have the gentleman here. But please make it short, because we have.
Okay, I'll try to stop Kushner, Lazarski University. So to begin with, Richard, you mentioned that computers allowed to decide. Again, with the development of civilization, with invention of new computers, new technologies, this will allow to solve new problems. Yes. So my reflection is that. Okay, computers allow to solve the problems which did not exist before computers appeared. Yes? Why to solve the issues of the European Union with steam engines? Again, why to come back to the era of nation states? I mean, a restoration of that national sentiment, identity, to address the contemporary issues. And second thing is, my reflection is, okay, being united geopolitically, European Union was quite a convincing power on a global scale. If United Kingdom would decide to conduct foreign policies, global policies by itself, don't you think that these policies would not be as powerful? Thank you.
We'll have one more question now or comment. There is a man in the back here, or yes. And then we'll have some closing answers and comments for the panel.
Well, yeah, as you've been kind to mention in the beginning, talking about an issue doesn't solve one. So I basically treat this panel as more a intellectual game rather than some solution finding. And I have tons of questions, among them difficult ones referring to psychology, to politics, even to the fact whether there are more bearded Daniels in the room than just two of us. But what is the great point which I wanted to ask about is, well, basically maybe a simple one. What kind of perfect divorce would you see, which would be fair on both sides? And I would like to ask both sides to answer quickly, shortly this question, because I know it could be actually a 10-hour debate on that. But simple facts: how would a perfect divorce, apart from the fact that it's not in French, look like on both sides? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I will ask Barbara to start with answer or comments to this. Yes.
The perfect divorce. If you have a divorce, there are actually no winners. So this is the first point. And we in economics, or as economists, try to create added value and win-win situations. So this is a very lame comparison. From a European perspective, I hope that that London will be the Singapore of Europe, and that we will be forced to more competition, to open our eyes again, and not remain in the constant comfortable, oh, it will work out, we will solve the problem sometime later. So it will be a challenge for us that we meet this challenge. However, to be honest, I doubt that this will happen. So, bad thing. With regards to the other question, I would say we should not go back to nation states. This concept caused a lot of troubles. Let's look in history, what we have seen. I think we should overcome them and look more at a little bit of this liquid democracy that I meant when I was talking about competing regions and about Europe that is more than those nation states and those 27 nation states. But again, and it's Europe, not the European Union. And I think this is what we should look at. And I'm very thankful for you making the remark about security and borders and defense. This is definitely something that we in Europe, not EU, Europe, should look at a defense policy that we have not even discussed at all, not even started to discuss into depth. Thank you.
Richard?
Thank you. Are we solving the problems of the 21st century with the solutions of the 19th century? No, I don't think so. I think the problem is that the European Union is trying to solve the problems of the 21st century with the solutions of the 1950s. The world is expanding, distances are shrinking, and therefore we need to expand our horizon. We need to think globally rather than regionally. And the big problem of the European Union, as I said, the Fortress Europe mentality, it's shut out the rest of the world. So the UK, I'm hoping, is going to become much more expansionist, much more internationalist. Are we going to have transitional problems? I think they are greatly exaggerated. There were mentions earlier of the collapse of UK agriculture. Well, firstly, I'm not sure that will happen. When New Zealand liberalised its agricultural system, it actually improved, it increased. Second, even if it does collapse, agriculture is such a tiny part of the UK economy. It creates a small number of very low-paid jobs, most of which actually done by Polish people. And therefore, so I'm afraid, yes, if there is a collapse in the UK economy, it will be Poland that suffers, not the UK. But these aren't big problems. We can deal with those problems. Yes, there's a problem with trade in services and non-tariff reforms and things, but actually, in terms of liberalising trade in services, that has been one of the European Union's big failures to do that. So actually, we're not losing very much because there isn't very much liberalisation of trade and services within the EU anyway. So the transitional arrangements, I think, are grossly exaggerated. Are we going in for a bit of nationalism? Well, yes, when there's a transitional problem, you wave the flag and you sing the national anthem and everyone feels a bit more confident. So yes, we might do a bit of that for the next few years, but it's just to make everyone feel together while we get through this little transition. Don't read too much into that. And finally, the perfect divorce. One thing I keep having to explain to people is, whatever the deal is, whether there's a deal or not, we're going. We've given notice, 2 years, May 2019, we're off. Now, do we have a deal after that to have some sort of relationship with the EU? I hope so, yes. I hope we do have some deal. I hope that we have some access to trade, access to markets, that we continue to cooperate on some projects, some scientific research things, exchange of students, things like that. And yes, we'll be willing to pay a modest amount for participation in those existing programs. But if Juncker won't do a deal, we're off anyway. It's not like a divorce. We don't need the courts to approve the divorce. We've delivered notice. We're going. What happens after that, whether there is a relationship after that, is largely down to the EU, the Commission, and whether they're prepared to talk sensibly in a sober manner and do a deal on that.
Daniel, what are your comments about the divorce?
Well, I think the divorce analogy is not too bad after all. Very simple, because there are still some contractual relations. The UK still has to pay alimony for a while. Yes, you do. You have contracts.
We've not got a contract.
Oh, come on.
You've been notice on the contract. There's a 2-year term.
Well, you have long-term... Not even talking about bureaucrats you have to send to Brussels, who have been employed, and so on and so forth. So there is still things involved. But talking again about divorce, what is important for divorce is respect for one another, to have the best divorce possible. And I don't see it on either side. Neither on the UK, who triggered the divorce, and if you look at the discussion, it's not a free market discussion. And there will not be only a bit of nationalism. There is already a rampant nationalism in the UK. And it's very sad. And you say, okay, the Polish work in the agricultural market, yeah, they will be gone if you continue that kind of policies. And that is very unfortunate. At the same time, Mr. Juncker, what he said on the panel was absolutely a disgrace for Europe when he said he will talk in French because English is losing importance. That's not how you engage in a respectful conversation. That's not what you do. So the ideal scenario would be that the UK gets a trade deal that is similar to the European Economic Community, a similar case like Norway has it, that we still can work together economically. That's the best case scenario. And what also would be good, usually after a divorce, you change. You get a new haircut, and so on and so forth. What would it mean for the EU? What would it mean for the EU? You work out and so on and so forth. So what would it mean for the EU? We reform the EU that we have proper federalism, that we have proper subsidiarity, that we talk about defense and borders on the EU level, but that we talk about taxes on a lower level, that we have a Europe of regions, as Barbara said, within the framework of the European Union. Because, and that is important, you cannot have a defense European Union, you cannot have common borders, you cannot have internal trade without a deciding body at some point. And that is something that you need to strengthen the European Parliament, you need to cut the power of the Council, and you need to cut the power of the Commission.
Thank you, Daniel. Mikołaj, and as a lawyer, how do you see the divorce?
Well, I have no marital or divorce experience, so I'm not going to continue that analogy. But there is a recent book by a human rights lawyer in Britain called, and I think it's a very apt title for free market Brexiteers, and so it's called The Fantasy Island. And it's a beautiful fantasy. I really like it. I believe in free and open trade. But yes, I think the services point is really serious. And I think you know, the thing about agriculture, it's not really about how big of a percentage of an economy it is. It's about how politically mobilize the people who are going to protect their interests are. So trade unions and so on. So again, fantasy island, a beautiful fantasy, and I do fear. I don't think it's going to be the biggest tragedy ever. There have been real tragedies in history, but it will be very, very, very difficult for the Right Honourable Prime Minister to make Brexit a success as she promised. Thank you.
And the last comment from Spasimir before we finish the panel.
Thank you. Yes. Well, the argument about the divorce, I think, is very important. But whom suffers most from the divorce are usually the children. And the essence of the European Union, who are the children, are actually all those who started benefiting from understanding that these four freedoms work. I don't think that those threats about Poles leaving suddenly the Great Britain will take place. I mean, migrants are much more stubborn than people tend to believe, and they will defend their possession that they already managed to gain also on the island. But the main problem today for the European Union are two things. First of all, over-regulation, absolutely unnecessary. And the second thing is ununderstood regulations, which is even worse. And if, as Daniel said, subsidiarity is going to be the driving force for future reform of the European Union, we might be at the point where we can again win the hearts and minds. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think all our panelists deserve a round of applause.